Huge political story at the beginning of the week, and even at the weekend, as this started to be briefed out, was Rachel Reeves going to the Commons and saying, look, the Tory government have completely screwed us over. We've got a £22 billion black hole in the public finances.
I'm talking about the money that they were already spending this year and had no ability to pay for, which they hid from the country. Some, including the leader of the opposition and the shadow Chancellor, have claimed the books were open. How dare they? It is not true.
Cue Jeremy Hunt, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, saying, no, you knew about it. This is just playing politics.
She will fool absolutely no one with a shameless attempt to lay the grounds for tax rises she didn't have the courage to tell us about. She says, Mr. Speaker, the information is new. But she herself told the Financial Times, you don't need to win an election to find out the state of public finances, as we've got the OBR now.
It's lots of money. And it does seem that Rachel Reeves was actually right. There's sort of a letter came out from the OBR, didn't it? The Office of Budget Responsibility.
Yeah, so both the OBR and the Institute for Fiscal Studies have come out and broadly backed Rachel Reeves.
I've no doubt they have discovered some specific issues, and particularly about how tough things are this year or immediately, which wouldn't have been quite so evident from the public pronouncement.
That's really interesting because Paul Johnson of the IFS spent the entire election saying that both the Tories and Labour were being very dishonest about spending plans, and he talked about this black hole existing basically for 6 weeks straight. So for him to come out and say, no, actually there's even more that we didn't know about, that does matter. Jeremy Hunt is trying to sort of argue that, firstly, that the black hole isn't there and it isn't completely there, and it's a result of Rachel Reeves giving the junior doctors a pay rise, and for other public sector
22%.
workers 22% and 5 to 6% for other public sector workers, which I've written a piece about that you can read on the New Statesman. But he's also trying to argue that Labour knew about it anyway, and I think that's a really odd argument to say, like, well, yeah, we created a multi-million pound black hole, but you can't blame us for it. Like, look at these guys, they didn't mention it either. I don't see that particularly resonating. And obviously the public sector pay rise is costly. It's about £9 billion, but it's not the full amount that has been uncovered. And there are some serious questions there about spending £6 billion on not processing asylum claims, essentially, when the Conservatives just said that they weren't going to process any. And that has led to vastly increased costs with keeping people in hotels because they can't be processed because the government at the time said, we're not going to process you. And also real questions about the cancelling of HS that's apparently going to cost $2 billion to not build it.
Yeah.
So serious questions for the party that sees itself as being the one that can be trusted on the economy, but simply going, they left us with this mess, isn't necessarily going to help when you're now the government in charge of trying to find some solutions.
And certainly the right-wing press have gone for Labour in quite a big way, because one of the major decisions they've had to make is restricting who receives winter fuel payments. So it's no longer going to be a blanket policy for over 75s. It's going to be restricted, so Rachel Reeves says, to those in receipt of pension credit.
Can I say something on that? Because this is something that has caused a lot of outrage. This is a universal benefit that goes to all pensioners, whether they are in poverty or whether they are millionaires. And I know I bang on about this stat, but if you are a pensioner in this country, you are statistically more likely to be living in a household that has assets worth over £1 million than you are to be living in poverty. You have a higher chance of living in poverty if you are virtually any age group other than over 65. This is, as a cohort, one of the wealthiest in society. Now, obviously, there are pensioners who are living in abject poverty and they need all the help that they can get. But the idea that this benefit should be universal and go to some of the richest in society because some of that age cohort are very poor, as opposed to targeting it at those who need it the most.
Which we do for every other age.
Which we do for every other benefit. I don't think that's regressive. And actually, economists will look at this from the left and the right and say the winter fuel allowance shouldn't be a universal benefit.
And it has been discussed in the past, hasn't it? I mean, not in the recent past in the election campaign, but it's not something that no one's ever discussed before about whether it's fair and you can spend the money a better way. I mean, it saves a fair bit of money, about $5.5 billion, doesn't it? But is it actually going to be doable? Because the former pensions minister, Guy Opperman, I think he said that it's actually not possible to do that, as in to sift out who is in receipt of a pension credit and who isn't. So you've got 11.5 million, roughly, pensioners. 10 million of them don't get it. I mean, I don't know why that would be.
Well,
but
government databases are not my expert topic. I would think if there was a database of people who are eligible for pension credit and claiming pension credit, it should be relatively straightforward to target this extra benefit at them. One of the issues is that people who are eligible for pension credit don't claim it, either because they don't know that they're eligible or because they don't want to. And so one of the arguments actually for means testing the winter fuel allowance is to encourage pensioners who are eligible and do need this benefit to apply. And I think there should be better information about what people are and aren't entitled to. But I think it's a bit of a cop-out to say, yeah, we can't do it because the computer says no. Like, get your computer systems in order.
Don't disagree with you in principle, but knowing a little bit about government IT systems, I think it's, if the computer does say no, it's a shed load of cash and a lot of time to get them working. But I don't disagree with you in principle. A number of other things are being scrapped to help get some of this fill the hole, if you like. So $5.5 billion this year savings, $8.1 billion next year. Those 40 new hospitals that we heard so much about under Boris Johnson, they're now under review.
I mean, they didn't exist anyway.
And they weren't hospitals really anyway. It was sort of a wing here and a
refurbishment there.
Yeah, refurb there. Scrapping road schemes, including a tunnel under Stonehenge.
Well, that one's very controversial. John Elledge actually wrote a column on that a while back, because there are people, even people who very much believe in infrastructure, who worry about the consequences of building a tunnel under the oldest monuments in the British Isles. But the transport cuts actually really do worry me, because this is what happens when governments are short of money and they cut infrastructure spending in order to meet day-to-day spending commitments, and then all of our infrastructure is crumbling and we go, oh no, why is this happening? And if Labour's big thing is going for growth,
yeah, I mean, how are you going to get it
without infrastructure? So yeah, I'm a bit worried about that one. The finding the money by reversing Rishi Sunak's idea to replace A-levels with T-levels. I mean, that was always a bit of an odd thing to focus on. Like,
not clear how it saves that much money either. But
well, I think the overhaul was maybe going to cost money, so we're not doing that. And then the other big one is obviously social care, which is another case of kicking probably the most difficult issue in politics.
This is so disappointing. So disappointing. Yeah.
Megan on our Spotlight team at the
Kenyon's written about this.
Yeah, and there were some arguments saying that the social care cap proposals, as they were set out, weren't really fit for purpose anyway, because there was this idea of a cap, but no thinking, or not enough thinking about how it was going to work and how it was going to be paid for, crucially. I think it all comes back to 2017 when Theresa May suggested a way to channel some of the housing wealth that is concentrated among that demographic back into social care, and obviously that didn't work out particularly well for her. So now the idea is we'll have a commission, we'll try and get cross-party support on this. I have heard all this before. Have you heard all this before?
Yeah, and Sir Andrew Dilnot's come out and he's very disappointed, isn't he? I mean, who made the original proposals for a way of improving the system that we currently have for funding social care. I think we talked about this during the election campaign, and most of us on the podcast were quite pleased that Ed Davey was actually raising this as an issue when nobody else was. And Wes Streeting really did make some quite positive noises about it. So obviously you have to act within your means, but as the thing to go when you've got 22% pay rise for doctors and other things is really quite sad to see.
I mean, Labour's hands are tied in a way, because this deficit did exist beforehand, but it existed in part because Jeremy Hunt made the decision to cut national insurance, and Labour made the decision to back that, and they didn't have to do that. They could have opposed it at the time in the autumn statement and then in the budget in March. Equally, they could look at these figures now and say, we wanted to give it to you, but we've looked at the books and it's too expensive. And so making the decision to keep that tax cut, that is a political decision.
We know that the first Labour budget will be at the end of October, 30th of October.
Halloween budget.
No, 31st is Halloween.
Almost Halloween. Halloween Eve budget.
What tax rises do you think we can expect to see in
Well,
that?
firstly, we can definitely expect tax rises in that. Rachel Reeves has said as much to a rival podcast that we won't name, but she is already sort of laying the groundwork for that. But she has been very clear that the commitments Labour made in its manifesto, no increases to income tax, national insurance or VAT, those will be honoured. Problem is, those are your three biggest and often easiest areas of tax to increase. So they're going to be looking to make up the gains.
We're going to see some
elsewhere.
kind of wealth tax, surely.
Capital gains, I think, is the big one, which is something that I remember in one of the debates, Keir Starmer said there were no plans to raise capital gains tax, and Beth Rigby sort of turned to the audience and said, for those of you who don't speak politician, we have no plans to do this, means we might do this, and we probably will. Possibly council tax as well. I mean, that's a particularly thorny one, but everyone agrees that the entire system needs an overhaul because they're based on valuations that just do not make any sense at the moment.
And maybe some tweaks in inheritance tax, or what you can and can't pass on, I imagine, could be in there as well.
But this is like relatively small amounts, and so it's difficult when you're tinkering
but
around the
relatively
edges.
small amounts on super high net worth individuals can bring in money. But yeah, I hear your point. Once you've ruled out the big three, it becomes increasingly difficult. I mean, just wrapping this up, do you think the public will blame the Conservatives for this, or do you think there might be a bit of a backlash against Labour?
I think Labour have done quite a good job of laying the groundwork for it. And I think, to go back to what we were talking about a moment ago, those two endorsements, as it were, from the OBR and the IFS have really helped on that front. Having Jeremy Hunt in Parliament, obviously he was expected to lose his seat to the Lib Dems and he clung on to it. That's a bit of a headache because he's there in the House of Commons. You know, Rachel Reeves is calling him a liar, he's calling her a liar, and that's got pretty bitter. But in a way, it kind of doesn't matter now because the Conservatives can make all the noise that they want to make. They don't get a shot at an election for another 4 to 5 years. And so if Labour can increase living standards and fix some of these problems, not all of them, but some of these problems by the time of the next election, who was to blame for it in the first place won't particularly matter as such. And we also should sort of point out the Conservatives have been using that line, the infamous note, there's no money left, as recently as last week. So you expect to hear a lot of banging on about this.